I started out as a journalist, and I was actually literally covering China and foreign correspondent. I was a foreign correspondent in Asia for a while. But once this story, the nascent story of the digital revolution and the internet were starting to kind of appear, I shifted my focus into that world. I happened to have a technology kind of background in high school and undergrad, which we could get into if it's relevant. But I was kind of one of the earliest journalists to really understand the implications of the digital revolution, and so I started writing about that very early. Think of it as the 1990s, early 90s. And Kevin Kelly, who was the executive editor of the nascent new magazine, Wired magazine, which was really became the place to really tell the story of the big picture story of the digital revolution of the internet, read my stuff, and Kevin sent me a two-line email and said, would you like to come work for us? Period. It would require moving to San Francisco. Period. That was all. He just sent it, and I said, oh yeah, okay, cool, I'm coming. So anyhow, I got there to work with Kevin and the early founders of the Wired, and covering that early story. I also ran the magazine as a managing editor eventually, right before Condé Nast bought it. And I kind of go into that detail, meaning I would kind of watched the very beginning of the last big boom, a really crazy kind of takeoff of technology and how that would affect the world. And I don't know how much detail you want here, but it also relates to Global Business Network. While I was there, I actually with Peter Schwartz, we co-authored what has become a kind of famous cover story at Wired called The Long Boom, which was our attempt from the mid 90s to actually talk about what could actually happen in the next 25 years to the year 2020. It was essentially telling the story from 1980, which is in our past, through the mid 90s where we were writing it into 2020, the whole big story. And it was a big picture story of how the digital revolution combined with globalization would change the world fundamentally and could really work out in positive ways. As since you guys are scenario guys, as Jay knows, it was essentially a positive scenario. It wasn't doing the kind of four square every direction thing, but it was trying to focus on one version of it, because at that time people had no idea how to understand what the hell how would a digital economy work? Why would it be different? Who cares about these goofball startups with Amazon? What's Amazon? Didn't know so it's selling books. Who cares? Anyhow, so we basically played that thing out, and it was initially a cover story at Wired, which sparked a national conversation. I mean, we had the economists, we had the Times, we had all kinds of people pushing back on it, thinking these guys were goofy. They were thinking, there were too out there. And but of course, it largely came to pass. And because of the interest in that thing, we did a book, and that's when I moved to GBN. I didn't work full time with GBN, but worked closely with Global Business Network in their offices in Emeryville at the time, because Peter and I were co-authoring this book. We did the book, went into multiple languages. I did keynotes on that for 10 years, as did Peter. Anyhow, the reason that's interesting now, I'll get a little bit more on my background, but just to skip ahead, I think we're in a very similar moment now with essentially AI. And my latest book that I'm really working on, which I'm calling The Great Progression, 2025 to 2050, which is also a Substack series, which is live now and been going. But anyhow, the idea here is to do the same thing for AI, essentially, that we did around digital technologies and the internet. Because it's my feeling right now that people almost no one's thinking big enough about what's going on here. And no one has any way to wrap their heads around how would the economy change or could change, how could the society change. And I think really, if you want to get into it in a trippy way, it's really going to be civilizational-scale change across the 21st century here. I mean, we are essentially entering an age of now humans and intelligent machines are going to wind through all our systems. And that is a huge deal, which I think people are really not grokking. And there's a frontline crew that's just freaking out about it, but they're not really wrapping their heads on the potential, particularly the positive potential of that. And that, like that long boom, I'm going to focus more on the positive potential, not discrediting, the worries and warnings and all various things going on there. But there's enough people doing that, enough organizations dedicated to that. What we don't have is enough people really in that virgin turf of what I call the grand narrative of the AI age here. The next, how does this work for everybody over the long haul? How could it transform all these, everything from education to healthcare to all these different fields? And I'm going to be tapping into the network, essentially some of the old network of GBN and Wired, but also my network that I've grown here for 30 years in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley of all these experts in all these different fields. Now, that's just to finish my story. Since Wired and GBN, after I left GBN in 2005, And because I did work for them eventually for about 4 years after the book, and doing the normal scenario planning thing, work with Stuart Brand quite closely in the network side of things. But anyhow, after that, I left to start what is really was about 4 different companies I've started. 2 of them were investor-backed startups, media startups, which were pioneering the early days of YouTube, and then another one pioneering the early days of actually Zoom. I mean, I had one of the first media companies ever to actually venture into this world, and I had a full-time employee working full-time, getting people like you to figure out where's the camera on the computer and how do you connect up the audio, and where do I look and how does this work? And anyhow, those days. So anyhow, I've had a few of my companies that way, ran them, founded them, and run them. And I also did media out of that. And then I also had a political startup, which might be worth talking about later. And I also just had a recent one where I started a series called Reinvent Futures. For the last 2 years, I was running for 2003 and 2004, and this is relevant to this project, centrally relevant. As soon as ChatGPT and essentially introduced generative AI in November of 2022, that to me was a kind of a boom, a shock. And by the way, we can talk a lot more about that. It shocked almost all experts in AI. I mean, and I know a lot of them. And I had a lot of them on camera basically say this. And I think it's worth going a deeper dive into that. But just for now, just say it shocked everyone. And so what I decided to do, because I'd been plugged for 30 years, knew a lot of people in this region, is I decided to host a series called The AI Age Begins. It was in kind of the hot new club in San Francisco called Shack 15, right in the top floor of the Ferry Building overlooking the bay. And the reason I did it there was that was the ground, that was one of the hubs of what they call the generative AI up and coming builders. These were the kind of 20-somethings that were similar to the 20-somethings in the 90s that were congregating around Wired, and we used to have the parties and everything that used to kind of drive those guys. But now this Shack 15, and there's also a lot going on in Hayes Valley, what they call Cerebral Valley now. But there's a younger crew that was there. And so what I was doing in these series was tapping into the younger up and coming crew that a lot of you don't know, but are kick ass. Including, by the way, one of the guys I had there showcased in my event is essentially one of the Doge kids who's basically dismantling the federal government right now. Because Elon saw the same thing about me as I saw this kid was super talented. He's literally about 22 right now. But anyhow, the point is that crew, and then it was the older guard that I had cultivated over 30 years, and we melded them together in a series of gatherings in 2023 and 2024. And what I would do with each of the gatherings, I'd take a big question, just one question for the night about AI, and we can go into some of those questions. And then I would ask a dozen like world-class experts to give 5-minute answer to it, and only 5, which we did a 3-camera shoot on, which, by the way, Alan, if you can literally plumb all that stuff. We developed them as a high quality kind of documentary style video of their answers. And then we'd invite only crew of about 250 to 300 people who also in their own right could have been speakers. I mean, everybody in that damn place was awesome. And we'd have these conversations that would go for about 4 hours. I mean, they'd start with a couple hours of programming and then 2 hours of kind of like a party. And we had top journalists from all over the country. I had, literally, I was a who's who. I had the New Yorker there. I had, Bloomberg Media. I had Business Week. I had, Forbes, because everybody was trying to figure this shit out. And no one really understood how to wrap their heads around it and how fast to go. And so it was a really interesting series. But I've wound that down because now I'm turning to this next project because enough people are talking about it. Enough of the big questions are kind of been discussed. And now my thing is we need to be thinking the next 25 years and how do we scale this thing and work for everybody. So that's a long introduction, but it also gave you a lot of the pieces of the puzzle of what I'm wrapping my head around right now.
Very good. Thank you. Now, I want to ask you a question, and that is, in your opinion, is the way computers work fundamentally the same as the way human brains work, or are they fundamentally different? I mean, as we talk about artificial intelligence, are we talking about the attempt to artificially create human intelligence or even a super intelligence brighter than human intelligence? Or does human intelligence work in fundamentally different ways than computers work?
Well, it's a little bit loaded because I know on this call how or at least the gist of probably where some of you guys are covered. But here's what I say, which I think is kind of nuanced way to explain that. I mean, on the surface of it, I would say no, they're not work like human brains, and very different. And for all the reasons, if we want to go into the detail of that, we can kind of go into that. But I would say I'm going to give the bigger picture way I think about it. I'm coming around to a kind of a different evolution in my thinking about that. So what we're thinking is neural networks. By the way, there's a whole history of this, which I'm assuming you guys know, but honestly, it's not clear because many people talking about AI don't really understand that it was essentially a significant shift in the history of AI that happened about 12 to 15 years ago. And we spent most of our time thinking one way we're going to get to artificial intelligence, and we ended up being a kind of a bottom-up neural network emergent way. And it sounds like you guys know all that, so I don't have to go over that. But that is something you should definitely get someone to go over that to kind of really lay. That's a wild and interesting story. Interesting story also, never count out the fringe, never ostracize the out-of-the-box thinkers, because in the end, they might end up being right, which they were. But anyhow, so we had that emergent kind of way of learning of neural networks, LLM. And so there is a side of that that is more human-like than the opposite way, which is human coders were going to code in everything about, oh, that's a chair, that's a block, that's what it's this is what happens, this is boom, boom, boom. That was the top-down way that we, all the back from the 50s that we were trying to do. And so in that respect, there's some parallels, like, oh, that's kind of how kids work, or that's how brains work, and so there's been some interesting parallels of that. And then, so I don't know enough about the human brain, whereas you guys do more, particularly, anyhow, I don't want to go into what you guys know already, but to my mind, what's interesting to me is if we don't really know how the brain works, maybe there is some overlap here in some crazy way that emerge. I mean, maybe neurons actually work more like the kind of neural networks, and vice versa. And maybe it's not a kind of, the surprise is not, astounding surprise that all of a sudden these computers approaching intelligence this way actually, and we're the one that broke through on it. So there might be some kind of things that are parallel. I don't know enough about the other side to actually make that parallel, but I would also say that I think there is an interesting middle ground here that we should and probably should be exploring. So that's one way I'd think about that question. The other thing I would stress about that question is, if you talk about intelligence, if human intelligence is the gold standard, then it's worth kind of parsing out why is it different and why isn't it different. But it's actually the differences alone are maybe the key to the whole thing, which is what's unbelievably amazing is that those brains could pull in literally insane amounts of data that the human brain is completely out of its league, couldn't even come close to. And we're watching it every day. I mean, it's just what's happening now with these chatbots and these agents are just, it's mind blowing. I mean, I could have, Stuart Brand, and you guys, Jay, too, but I would say Stuart assembled the most amazing brain trust I've ever been around in the 250 remarkable people in that network. But I mean, every day I'm talking to my ChatGPT and they're bringing me insights from every field I could ever think about at a pretty goddamn high quality, PhD level quality, it seems like to me. So that thing is a thing like, well, okay, it's not the same, but, maybe that's in some ways it's got an advantage over some of the stuff of our limits. And there's a lot of parallels there that I think are also interesting is, people going, oh yeah, but they hallucinate. Well, have you ever talked to a human being? I mean, they're kind of nutty all the time. I mean, I've had a million, I've had executive assistants. I've had I've hired tons of people in my lifetime. Did I ever 100% trust what they brought me? Was great? No, it's like I was looking at their work saying, what the fuck? You were stoned or what? Why did you get this? Is stupid. So I think there's a lot of kind of, we shouldn't really I think it's interesting how defensive humans get around this stuff and also how superior they think of themselves when they're calling out the thing for, and they say, oh, it's racially biased. Well, yeah, it's kind of trained off of all your freaking racial bias that's been put into the goddamn internet for 30 years. So I think it's kind of an interesting little kind of leveling the playing field a little bit here and kind of start to think about, who's got who's one up on the other or who's one down on the other. And also the other thing about theirs is they improve. And the improvement I've seen in the last 2.5 years is just mind blowing. I mean, mind blowing. I've never seen anything in tech move this fast. And that's another little thing, which is worth a little aside because I do a lot of, I think it's worth an aside here because I do a lot of public speaking on this. And one of the things I always find about this is there's some, what people, super smart business people, senior leaders of all kinds of organizations. I do a lot of speaking at that level, conference things, C-suites, boards. I do a lot. That's kind of what I do now, basically, strategic foresight and that stuff. And there's a lot of misconceptions. And one of the misconceptions is that, oh, this will be like the internet and it'll be really 10 or 20 years till this plays out. Totally wrong. It's like basically the internet in the mid 90s, we were saying someday we're going to figure out a way to get a fiber optic cable all around the world at this bandwidth. And oh, someday we're going to build, kind of, 5G kind of wireless networks that'll hit every kind of, town in America. And someday it'll be bandwidth big enough to move video. But it literally took dozen, 15, 20, depends what you're talking about, to do that, right? AI needs no infrastructure anymore. I mean, you can build a big, maybe bigger data center and maybe a little faster chips, but basically it's got everything it needs to go 0 to 60 right now, which is why it's moving so fast and why it's potentially going to go even faster, very fast here. And so there's no physical infrastructure. Again, beyond energy and more data centers, but that's essentially just a scaling thing. That's not a breakthrough thing, or like we didn't know how you were going to get high bandwidth connections through iPhones, to Utah, where Jay is. It's probably still not in Jay's world, right? But anyhow, the point is there was an infrastructure thing you had to build. Not the case. And so this is really going to hit fast. It is already hitting fast, but it's going to hit faster than almost anyone's thinking.
Now, given the differences between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, what do you think the future of their relationship will be?
Well, I'm a positive guy, as Jay knows. I'm on one of the optimistic, positive, can-do guys. I'm like a Peter Schwartz, and I are kind of competing to who's most optimistic about the world. But I think they are going to dramatically augment human beings. And I think the future ahead of us is going to be essentially us being harnessed with, or able to harness superpowers, basically, is the bigger way to think of it. I am not of the crew. And also, by the way, a lot of people I talk to, a lot of AI experts who are way more than me, that idea of it becoming essentially super intelligence to the point where we don't understand it and it just breaks away from us, to us becoming cattle and, at the whims of the super intelligence, that's just, that might never say never with human beings. Maybe it's 50 years, 100 years, I don't know, maybe centuries or something, it'll be a thing. But it's not the thing to worry about now. And I think that's actually what it does is distorts the real focus on what we should be focusing on. But it's also implied it's an advers it's an ad, if you see it that way, you see it as adversarial. You see it as displacing humans. You see it as working beyond humans. You see it as not even out of humans' control. That's a vision. That's a framework. That's a worldview that you have about that AI that I don't have. Now, it's debatable, and you can have a good debate on that. But my side is it's a tool. It's an awesome tool. It is probably the most awesome tool that humans have ever come up with. And it is going to amplify our powers in myriad ways. It's already happening. It's going to expand our scientific understanding of the world. It's probably, if you really want to get trippy, it could be another second enlightenment, because it's just going to open these ways. We had no idea how that worked. And now all of a sudden, whoa, it's happening with protein folding and some of these early low-hanging fruit. It's happening all over the place. But just think, when you have it robust, everybody using it in a million directions, it's just going to be an explosion of understanding of the world, including, I think, the brain, frankly, and human intelligence and, neuroscience and all that. I think it's just going to be crazy good like that. And it's, of course, have dangers in that. We can go down that path of, that same understanding of how to, viruses work are going to, you can get a pathogen that's going to kill the planet. I get that side of it. But I also get, wow, we understand how this works and how we could defend against it, or how we could do it to, design all these other ways to improve the environment and all kinds of stuff. So I am on the side of it is our ultimate tool. It's the last, I don't want to necessarily say the last tool, but it is like the biggest tool we've ever done. And it's landed on our laps, and here it is. So we got to start doing it.
And all of our tools are effectively prostheses. We just not had one that's a prosthesis of our thought process. Maybe writing was that way, and certainly language was. But now this is a much bigger prosthesis in that respect. And so,
Totally.
and it's also a collective prosthesis, which is, I think, another interesting piece of it. One of the questions that, it drives some of these weird ideas about whether we're going to be just, the pets of this thing, all have to do with this uh, idea of agency, of sentience, of we've seen people, even smart people, go, oh no, it's sentient. We've got to have special rules, special, all that ethical issues and so on come up. Um,
Mhm.
we don't know whether it is or not, and in fact, all this hot, weird talk about consciousness has, I think, confused the issue both with us and with machines. But first of all, what do you think about that? Is this a crazy conversation? Should we be having this conversation? Um, whether it is or is not, what do you think? Could it ever be?
Well, I think it's a great conversation to have. I mean, not the least of which is if we totally understood human consciousness and the human brain and neuroscience and like it was slap down, the way we know the basic physics about, in certain ways, just certainty, then then it'd be one thing, but we don't. And so I think what's interesting about this is, it's prodding us all to think, what is consciousness? Like, how did it work with us? Is it in animals? Oh, could it be a machine? I mean, those are like profound philosophical questions, actually, Jay, that I think it's a really fascinating time to be doing that. I'm kind of glad it's synergistic essentially with where we're at in human evolution. Almost is like, okay, we should be figuring that one out, and this is maybe going to help us think about it differently. So there is a kind of level of so that's a good thing in some ways to make us think. But the other thing about it is, as a guy who literally didn't think we'd be getting this level of AI at this time. I mean, I'm kind of also open enough to say, well, I'm never going to say never, and I'm certainly not going to say, could happen within, couple, generation or something, maybe less. And with that little side, let me tell you one thing about this, because I use this again, another way to kind of drive home the point. And again, maybe you folks on the call here, but if you want to kind of think of it as out there to explain to people, is for example, one of the guys I had, it was Adam Chair, who was the co-founder of Siri, and he was one of the speakers I had at just last year. I think it was 2024. And here's a guy. He's a relatively young guy, actually, and closer to my age, or kind of maybe a little younger than me even. But he said he'd been working for 40 years in artificial intelligence. That's all he'd been doing, artificial. And he had spent 30 years in basic conversational tech. He founded Siri, and Siri, one of the last things that Steve Jobs did before dying was he bought Siri. And, it had this crude thing. So you're kind of looking at Siri, if you're Apple owner, you're kind of like, okay, it's kind of been okay. But, basically, this is a guy who from the beginning was trying to figure out how to voice interaction with computers at a level of sophistication that emulated human conversation. And he literally, okay, on you can get the video right on my website, whatever they want to do on the YouTube. He says, I never thought in my lifetime I was going to see this. He said this to me was going to be some distant thing. We were dreaming for. We were going to be the people, that were just laying the groundwork in the 20s for, the nuclear bomb in the 30s or 40s, that kind of thing in terms of his field. And he said it blew him away. And he said, now that's not the only guy. I mean, I can go through a bunch of them, and I do go through a bunch of them I had there, and they're all saying the same thing. Maybe not all. There's a few that kind of are cocky about it. Like, anyhow, I won't go into the people that. There were a few people out there saying it was going to get this good fast. But anyhow, in general, it was literally 90% of the people out there said no. So the reason I'm saying that is it blew away even the smartest people in AI to get to this stage. So I'm kind of hesitant to say, well, it'll never get, beyond the bounds of our control, or it'll never be able to, or it won't be forever to worry about, or, maybe 100 years to worry about it. So as much as I say that, I also hedge it a little bit in the scenario tradition of like, it's not clear. Maybe there's some breakthrough that, who knows? And maybe it will be conscious in a way that we don't understand, because we don't frankly fully understand how conscious happens anyhow. So anyhow, that's the way I would answer that, with those two kind of ways of thinking about it. And I think this project is one of them. That's one of the reasons I'm interested in this project, is to kind of hear from others about, okay, well, where do you guys fall on this stuff?
Oh, so to just expand on that, what should you expect if it's one or the other? I mean, how will it change things? Obviously, if like Kevin says, if AI wants something, now as far as I can see right now, we're not at a point where we should even worry about it. But what would be the consequences if AI wants something, or if AI could never want something?
Well, the main thing being, and this is where you start tripping out about, intelligence in the universe and all kinds of stuff is, it's just if you have an intelligence edited to your environment that can improve itself dramatically over time in a way that you can't, waiting for genetic evolution. Or, I mean, I guess you could say we could juice ourselves up with genetic engineering, which might be, in 100 years, maybe it's going to be genetically engineered human brains against, some kind of rogue AI. I mean, it's not crazy to think that's, a sci-fi plot of 50, 100 years out there. But as of now, we're still kind of trapped within evolution and slow kind of evolution of our intelligence. And if that thing we know, I mean, it just gets better by the freaking month. I mean, the latest releases just keep coming out. And so that does start getting worrisome because, that's a wild card. I mean, it's like we've never been in an environment where your enemy can get, exponentially better by the month or something. It's like humans don't know how to defend against that. We don't know how to negotiate against that. We don't know how to do anything around that. So that is a game changer. The question is, how much time do we actually spend working on that right now? Because out of that, that's maybe 1/10 of the thing to think about. There's another 90% of stuff that we could deal with now, including the thing which I think is closer to home is, we're going to resort human labor and machine labor around intelligence, like starting now. And that could be hugely disruptive in a way that's immediate and now, as opposed to like someday, they might get conscious and take us down. So I just kind of think we're kind of a little bit not focused on right. I mean, for this project, I'm happy to go in that direction and spend all the time doing that. But I'm just saying, in the general, in terms of what's happening out there in the intellectual public intelligence kind of intellectual world, we're spending a lot of time in that world, and it's like, no, dudes, it's like you got to look this straight on. It's like, I mean, just even this week, I don't know how much you guys track this day to day, but what happened with ChatGPT, able to kind of generate new images now that were just the graphic breakthrough on that is huge, and it's actually already freaking the hell out all these graphic designers, human graphic designers all over the place, because this is getting freaking real. I mean, literally, the New York Times, they had a freaking thing going on even just this weekend. They're already reacting to it. It's like people screaming, and Actors Guild are striking, and stuff's happening all over here now, and it's just beginning. And the question is, how do you build a society that transitions through this, and how do you do it in a way you don't leave a lot of people behind, and how do you do it in a way that doesn't freak the hell out of people? And those are like today questions we should be thinking about, and we aren't. I'll give you one other anecdote. It's fascinating to me. I was just down at yesterday. I'm on the leadership council of Congressman Ro Khanna. I don't know if you know Ro. Ro represents one of the nodes of the valley. But he's also a progressive guy, and he, was the co-chair of Bernie Sanders' national campaign last time, and not 24, but 20. And so he's a progressive guy, and he also gets tech. And I went down to his leadership council, which is frankly a lot of people who max out on giving, which is not me, but then he has a handful of people like me just ask, for advice and stuff like that. And he had 5 other top progressive, up and coming, next generation Congress people there, which I can go into if you want. But anyhow, serious players. And we were there for 2 hours. And honestly, and they opened a question up for everybody and all kind of stuff. And they didn't let me ask a question because they knew I was the ringer going to ask all the questions. But basically, AI came up once. It was one freaking question. And it was a stupid question. It was like, how are you going to influence the Trump administration, kind of set the rules, and what role could you play? And I was kind of like, this was down in San Mateo. I mean, it was the heart of Silicon Valley. A lot of the people who donated the money were older tech people, to be fair. They weren't the next generation. They're at the point of their life they can give away money and all that stuff. But I found it absolutely fascinating that they were not even talking about what's coming here in a way that's just astounding to me. I mean, and so I think even the people who are best positioned to fucking wrap their heads around this thing are not seeing it. And but that's not going to stop it. It's going to just hit it even harder, and it's going to be something that's just going to be a huge disruptor. And again, I'm a positive guy. We can make the transition. It's going to augment us. We're going to generate all kinds of other jobs. Maybe we want to kind of cut the work week in half. Maybe we get done in half the time what we need, and you can live well. And anyhow, there's a lot of ways you can do this, but no one's even freaking talking about it. That's a problem.
Now, so you're talking about it. We're talking about it.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying us. I'm just talking about, outside the, small
And
circle.
one of the critical ways we're talking about it is through scenarios.
Yeah.
And as you well know from your experience with GBN, we often, not always, but we often create scenarios on a 2x2 matrix,
Yeah.
where the matrix is created by the two most fundamental uncertainties in the future, what we don't know. Would you give us a couple of suggestions of what those axes ought to be? What are the biggest uncertainties regarding AI looking into the future?
Oh, those are good. I mean, usually you have a day to sit there and look at the thing and put a post-it note up here. So you call me on it. But I would say one is what we just described. Will it primarily augment us, or will it be primary work independent of us? And because that is like one of the big questions. And the reason is if you can totally be independent of us, then you could imagine a regime or a society or an economy where it's just run by machines and empowering an elite, essentially an oligarchy that essentially would just suck it all out. And that could be a total disaster for societies, democracies, whatever you want to talk about. And that is one of the great fears that's already starting to happen here with what's going on in politics right now with, Elon Musk, right out of central casting, the oligarch, the billionaires, Trump, right out of central casting. They've taken over the government. What are they doing? They're laying off all the people. What are they doing? They're bringing in AI. I mean, that thing is we don't have to literally imagine where that's going to go. I mean, that's happening. I do think there's another way to do it, and it is more than augmented way of doing it, at how we superpower our productivity, at how we can just punch up productivity rates and growth rates and spread prosperity and move it through society differently, and do all kinds of stuff we need to do and want to do and couldn't do in the 20th century. So there is another scenario, and that's one of the ones I'm trying to do with my book and my Substack series. But I'm saying right now we're at that point. So that axis is that would be my first one. Absolutely. There's another axis, which if you want to go into geopolitics, which is kind of related to it, is essentially, does the world become dominated by essentially a Chinese version of AI, or a kind of, I would call it, American version of AI, but Western, or whatever you want to call it, democracy. So there's a kind of a democratic, pluralistic society version, or a totalitarian, authoritarian, top-down society. And that's kind of playing with the same. No, it's not exactly the same thing, because that's more about what kind of society you work in. And that is a real thing going on right now. I mean, that is literally playing out right now. And again, mostly behind closed doors, or at least amongst a very small elite crew that's thinking this. And one of my last events I had in 2024, I was looking at the question of the night was, how could AI accelerate what do we call it? How could AI accelerate breakthroughs, or whatever? I guess accelerate. How could AI accelerate progress in bioengineering and healthcare? Was the question of the night, and I had a dozen people speak. One of the people I had speak there was the newly appointed head of biological technologies at DARPA, and he had flown in from DC because he knew we were doing this thing. And once he was flying in, I said, "Yeah, I'll have that guy speak." And but the reason is like the military is all over this shit right now. And I'll give you another little thing. I was called to a thing down in Stanford, a group that was called by the Air Force, and this was before the election. And I was asked to become. It was like a working group of maybe I don't know, 30 people. I was sitting right next to a guy who's now in the Trump administration, but at the time I didn't know. He just sounded like a Hoover Institution guy, kind of more of a right wing guy. But the Air Force, same thing. The whole conversation was about how do we compete with China now around AI? And it's not just AI, it's AI, it's drones and all kinds of stuff, cyber attacks and whatever. So the point is, that's another really interesting one, and I think that's an interesting one because there's a lot of implications of that one, but one of them is that it could be the one thing that might stitch back America into a kind of a less polarized society, because this could be the epic geopolitical struggle of our, the 21st century. Kind of like the Cold War and all that happened in the 20th around nukes. This might be something similar on AI. And I'm not a China hater or anything, and I've spent a lot of time in China. But it is shaping up since Xi to be kind of, oh my God, what happens if China is the one that rolls this shit out for everybody or most of the world? And anyhow, that it's a big deal. So, or you can even see your own version here. It'd be like authoritarian Trump, gets it rather than democratized open society guys. So anyhow, that's another one. We could kind of brainstorm all day, but so those would be two ones. The other one I would say is, I think, a big one that's interesting. Again, it's kind of a theme I'm laying out here. But one would be, is it going to be decentralized, many, many, many AIs, or is it going to be centralized AI? And that also implies, is it going to be big tech and a handful of companies doing it, or is it going to be a million flowers booming and smaller things, and to the point where it's even just, you'll have an AI in this and it doesn't even have to connect to the internet. And that's an interesting debate playing out right now. In terms of this DeepSeek thing in China, is kind of this idea of, well, maybe we don't need the big companies and you can do it lower and lower. Now, that said, they're still dependent on those initial LLMs that were built. But anyhow, there's a point in that's starting to be a debate. And then there's the perennial one, which hits every one of these tech junctures, is open or closed. Is it going to be an open system of AI in which we all learn together, but also, spreading the world to bad dudes? Or is it going to be a closed thing where, in some ways, from a safety point of view, you could kind of make an argument it's closer to the nuke thing, and I don't want too many people with this shit. But on the other hand, that's a society that just gets really out of whack very fast, because whoever controls that technology then wins. And if you're outside banging on the door, it doesn't go anywhere. So anyhow, a lot of these, they're kind of, there's a kind of a big, small, decentralized, centralized, that kind of stuff would be one space. And we can return to that later. But anyhow, that's where I would go with my first hit on that.
I'm kind of interested to riff off of that in a different direction, and that is, in the West, we're particularly interested in getting AI out there in front of us. I'm going to have a personal assistant, and they can do whatever I want, and that sort of thing. And then there's the AI that nobody knows is working, that's watching you. The surveillance AI, and both of them are real. Both of them are happening. How do you see these playing out? So now I'm not talking about who's going to win and here's a battle of the AIs and that sort of thing, but actually different kinds of AIs and how they're going to affect us. For example, one of my favorite versions of this is Johansson being her in that movie. This is a very personal AI. It turns out it wasn't personal after all, but in fact, it could easily be that you get personal AIs that are your own personal companion. On the other hand, then you've got the kind of surveillance AI that I think is already happening in China to some extent, and probably happening here, and we just don't pay attention to it. How are they going to play out with respect to each other, too?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. It's been an interesting. I think this gets into almost a generational discussion too, which I think is one thing I've been thinking about in my series and my book is really going to play this out a lot, which is, to what extent are we going through the transition we're going through? It's just another cycle of tech, or just another cycle of politics, or just another cycle of, maybe as big as the Reagan Revolution or something changing. There are these cycles in history. But in fact, my piece going out tomorrow, which, by the way, take a look at it if you want, but it's related to this a little bit, which is, to my mind, what's going on in the country today, in the world today, is the closest thing we've seen to it in recent memory was essentially the reinvention of America and the world in the wake of the post-war boom, basically coming off the war, in which we really wholesale for the next 25 years reinvented, domestic politics through welfare states, Pax Americana, and all this stuff that happened. And there's a million ways we can go into that, a million ways. But it all happened in 25 years, by the way. It wasn't like, 0 to 60. It just went boom. A lot of shit happened. But what's weird, and this is a thing which we could have trip out on for a while if we wanted to, but you go back, that's 80 exact years ago. 1945 is 80 years from today. You go back 80 years from that, it's 1865. It's the Civil War. And essentially the same fucking thing happened in America. A total reinvention in the wake of that. There was a Reconstruction. We tried the best we could of the South, but mostly outside of the South, we just were on a roar. I mean, it was crazy. Homestead Act and land grant universities and transcontinental railroads and the whole steel, Bessemer steel. I mean, it was a crazy ass boom. You go back 80 exact years, and it's 1785, and we're fucking going into the Constitutional Convention. And then, of course, America invented itself essentially right there. There's some it has to do with generation, a bunch of stuff I could trip out on. But basically, about every 80 years, America goes through a fundamental reinvention. And so I think we're at the very least, we're one of those from an American point of view. But I think it's even bigger. I think it's going back, because if you go back to what was going on with the American Revolution or that Constitution, that was part of even the bigger civilizational invention of basically the West, financial capitalism, industrial production, mechanical engines, nation states, and representative democracy. We were part of, we were the one piece of an even bigger puzzle. But I think with AI, and this is only, you can only trip out with people like you on this because everyone else thinks you're like a lunatic, because you start thinking we could actually be closer to a civilizational scale change here about what's going to happen in the 21st century. And that is kind of driven primarily by AI, but a lot of them. There's clean energy, there's bioengineering, there's all kinds of stuff that are like, we've never had these powers before. And now we have them. And so it's not like the design of the thing we did 250 years ago to govern ourselves in an age of AI is probably inadequate, or, you can start going down that level. But I think that, so the reason I'm kind of backing up on this thing, which is we're at this juncture. If you think we're in a total world changing juncture, which actually I do believe that actually in my heart, it's not just an idea. I think we're in that thing. And I think it's bigger than almost anyone's thinking about right now. And if you're in that thing, then some of these questions get answered differently than the questions if you're working within, if the Trump administration gets bumped out in, 4 years and, the Dems come in and they kind of rebuild the bureaucracy here and there, and then anyhow, that's a different way of thinking about the world. Because I think it's the bigger picture thing. I think we're at a juncture where we are really going to fundamentally have to rebuild shit in a way that's really going to be wild. So now I love that shit. So to me, I'm like a pig in shit, but most people are freaked out about that shit. And so, that's why we're in a really kind of perilous time now. And I would say that's a lot of what's going on with these authoritarian backlashes around. It's like people are freaking out. It's why you're seeing people go back to religion. And I mean, there's make America great again, like the 1950s. We actually understood that fucking world, right? Okay, just bring back the manufacturing. What my dad did. That's all I want, keep the prices low, But I think we're in a very different world. And I think the better way to go is you got to go, okay, how do you pick up those same values? Looking out for everybody, jobs for everyone, meaningful work, take care of old people, healthcare for everyone. How do you do it in a 21st century way with bioengineering, AI, and all these other things that we thought would have been magic back then. If they were designing, the shit, they would have looked at, how do you do that? So anyhow, that's kind of the level of thinking I'm trying to get people to think at. And so I guess now I'm forgetting your specific question, but what you prompted me to say it like that, because I think my answer to what you're asking would be different if you think which one of those scenarios you think. So remind me again, what was it exactly? I kind of lost it.
Basically trying to distinguish, the AI as personal assistant, as butler,
okay.
versus the AI as,
Okay.
background
Okay.
surveillance, keeping track of things.
So here's where I would go to that. That's why I was kind of giving that backdrop, which is a long backdrop. But I would just say, I think it's possible that the economies and societies of the future, particularly in the West, but all over, are going to have to be more transparent. We're going to have to actually have, for a lot of reasons, including security. But I think, and it's going to be a trade-off that future generations are going to make. And I think what's interesting about the demographics on this thing, including me, as Jay pointed out, I'm getting older too, but I think the boomer and plus crew grew up in a world of analog world where privacy meant one thing, and it was shit, no one knew what I was doing when I was out smoking pot in the garage, away from my parents or whatever the fuck it started, however you thought about privacy. But I'm saying, I think if you talk to millennial, my daughter's a millennial, like, she's all her life is out on social media. Like, people know more about her than I know. I mean, it's like, what the hell is she doing? I don't know. But then all her friends know. And then the same thing. So I think, and they're not worried about tracking stuff. They're not worried about all that. It's like, if they opt in on, all this cookie stuff. Do you want your website to have cookies tracking you? They're like, it's like, of course you do. It's like going to tell me what I like. It's going to show me the thing I want to buy. And in half the time that me fucking starting from scratch is going to go. It's like, it's just a different way of thinking about information or security or privacy. And so I think that's giving us a little thing. I think in an AI age, we're gonna the older generation gonna maybe have to get over themselves, but basically I think it's gonna be more like that. You're just gonna say, and I think the other thing that's gonna drive it is security. I mean, yeah, it's bad if you're in China and they can look at you, but it's also bad if you're in a situation where some bad guy has got a genetically modified virus that could literally knock out the country in about 30 days. And, no one knows where he is because, we've got all this privacy shit to the point where the guy, can't be located, can't be stopped, cops can't do it and blah, blah, blah. That's also bad, and I think that's partly going to drive. I think that is going to be a big driver, is actually the security side of this too.
So I'm going to push a question that we've not asked anyone yet, but you're sort of rambling on in this direction, so I thought I'd grab this one. Clearly, you're talking in global terms. And one of the big challenges is, I think one of the main chaoses in the world now is that governmentation, how whole millions of peoples are governed is changing radically. We have a slow system. It's a very slow, and one of the, I think, attractions of a lot of autocracies is that they're fast and nimble, so they kind of walk over everybody at the same time. Clearly, AI is the kind of thing that's going to be able to speed this up. It's going to make it, in a sense, make global much more easy. How do you see AI written big?
Well, I think if and again, you're talking about a kind of crazy optimist guy, but and a bit more of a guy who likes the vision stuff. But here's what I think is going to happen. And it sounds crazy if you're just talking about like this in 2025, in March 2025. But I think we're going to essentially have to invent a kind of a digital AI empowered kind of democracies. If you had the founders sitting around today and thinking, how would you create a government that captures the will of the people, protects the rights of the minority in a pluralistic society, avoids tyranny, but, gets shit done, you wouldn't do what they did 250 years ago. It's like a freaking kludgy thing that is completely nuts and doesn't get anything done, or almost.
Right. So I'm trying to figure out how you envision it.
Well, again, I don't have the plan. I'm just one guy trying to figure it out. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to essentially watch, and I don't know how long it's going to take to do it. And it might not even take in the next 25 years. I'm trying to think the next 25. It might take a little longer than that. But basically, we're going to invent a way to tap into understanding those things in an AI-infused world, which is, what does the majority want? But, that could be way better than just like, let's vote every 4 years and give some guy who's representing 1 million people to kind of go into there, and he's bought by, the corporates, and he goes into a thing with 425 other people, and they cut deals and seniority, and the guy who happens to be 80 years old and can't even think, is basically the head of the thing because, like Dianne Feinstein, like she was literally comatose, and she's like the head of it because she's been in there forever. It's like, that's an insane way to govern a country, and it's like, that's where we are. So I think it's just going to get with climate change and all of this shit. They're just going, we can't do this anymore, people. It's like, whether it takes a constitutional convention in the old ways or something, but we're going to start over. Or start over in a big way. And I don't even know exactly how it's going to play out, but essentially, if these tools are going to revolutionize how you do the economy and how you do healthcare and education, it can do the same for freaking government and democracy. I mean, it just can. And so that's one thing that's going to happen. And then the other thing, I think, which is a kind of favorite bugaboo of GBN since, the old days, Global Business Network, is I think we're going to have some kind of global governance systems that essentially go beyond the nation state, which is a completely same thing. Enlightenment era, kludgy thing, completely out of whack for climate change and all the planetary issues we got. And I think it's not going to mean there's going to be a cabal of, 7 people at the top who run everything, but it's going to be some kind of crazy AI-empowered coordination systems, negotiated systems, I don't know, something that's going to basically allow us to get shit done in the light of climate change in ways that everyone can kind of buy in and say, all right, we're with that one. It's not everything we want, whatever, but we get that we have to give up that to do that. Anyhow, something that'll be in that way. Again, those two things are just open whiteboard from me right now. I don't know how we would do that, but just like you couldn't really know in the mid 90s, you said someday everyone's going to be connected through full bandwidth, and you'll be able to get, buy shit anywhere, you in the planet and get, talk to your mom over video. You didn't know how that was going to happen in 1995. But it happened, because, you could kind of see the potential of the technology. You could see the entrepreneurial energy around it. You could figure out humans are going to figure that shit out. They're going to be incentivized to figure it out. We're going to do it. And we did it. Now, and I think we're just going the next notch up is like, oh, now we got even more tools. Like, holy shit. It's not just connect everybody. Now we got this intelligent machines to help everyone do it 5 times as much at 5 times as fast with it, to innovate. And then, so why would we say, oh, it's impossible to invent at that level? I don't think that's the case. Now, of course, what could screw it up? A million things, politics, fear, stuff happens. But I'm just saying we should at least be contemplating the opportunity space that we actually have now to actually do that. And if we want to walk away from that, or if it's just a bridge too far that we can't pull off, okay, whatever. It's like there's 8 billion of us on the planet, and so we got to figure it out together somehow. But anyhow, I think that's one way to think about it.
It's a real, given global problems like pandemics, like global warming, it does seem clear that we need some new global governance, but nobody wants a global government. We don't want the Brusselization of the planet. So figuring out how it can be global governance without being global government is not altogether clear.
I think that's true, but I do think what's interesting about AI, and it's only in the last 3 years. It's like, I don't know how many. We had a bunch of these conversations 25 years ago with GBN and all that. We also had stuff around climate change 25 years ago, and those were all relevant and ahead of the curve. But to be fair, too, but we didn't really think about AI because it was such a distant dream. It is like, yeah, maybe someday humans will figure that out, but we didn't think about it. Now we have it. Now we kind of go, holy shit. I mean, maybe now we can start doing that. I mean, I think it seems like the scaling. The other thing I think we just got to go is I think the scales we as humans thought we were limited by are now being surpassed. Meaning AI can deal with the scale that is just literally mind blowing. Like we can't even come close to it. I mean, it's just like, how did it do that? You just can't. And I just think, so that should make us think a lot of stuff. Like, yeah, so if it was a bunch of humans in a bureaucracy trying to coordinate between 200 countries to kind of figure out a problem, that would be difficult. I mean, that's the climate accords. I mean, we've been doing it for 40 years now, and we haven't got anywhere, barely anywhere. But AI doing that, they could fucking do it in a month or something. They could probably come up with 5 ideas that were like, oh, these seem to be the closest 5 things we could do. And, why don't we vote on that or something? I mean, I don't know. I'm just ballparking and spitballing here, but I'm saying that's actually something you can start doing now in a way you couldn't have done even 5 years ago.
I would ask one last question, if I could, and that is, whenever we come up with new technology and we lay it out, we throw it out there, the main thing that happens is there's a whole lot of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
I want it to go this way. I want it to solve this problem. I want to make this possible. And then surprise, something else comes up. I mean, that's what happened certainly with social media. We had no idea what it was going to do to politics. We had no idea. We were wrong at all of our guesses. I suspect that that's one of the other things we want to think about in the future here is that AI is going to have these kind of unintended consequences. We're really good at thinking about, oh yeah, just extrapolate out. It's going to screw up. It's going to be good for medicine. It's going to screw up. Literature and arts and maybe maybe the people in the newspapers are going to be all gone. There's going to be no reporters left. Who knows? But those are sort of the kind of intended consequences we can imagine. How do you want to think about unintended consequences?
Well, first of all, I get the wrong guy for that, but there are plenty of people out there that would love to tell you a bazillion of them and all kinds of stuff that are happening. But I will say this: I want to push back on this just because I I think
I'm
it's
just
become
talking
a
about surprises. It doesn't have to be bad. It could just a
yeah, no,
surprise.
no. But I also just want to say it's become a trope in America discourse that social media has been a disaster. And you can and they all focus on misinformation and information silos and teens being feeling like whatever, feeling all the social pressures, and those are true, and I'm not gonna deny that. But I will say the other thing about this, and again, without being kind of the Pollyannish about it, is like I don't think anyone wants to get, well, maybe some people, but almost no one wants to totally give up social media. I mean, it's also stitching together incredible. I mean, like I am connected to my grade school kid friends, my high school friends, my cousins, my mom, my college friends, my grad school friends, my it's like I've got like when I send an out idea, what's going on with me, it goes to 1,000 people. In a way that in the old days I'd have to write a letter and I get to one guy and then I have to carbon copy it and send it to someone else. I mean, I just want to point out that there are some unambiguously good things that have come with this and that we aren't dismantling. I mean, why wouldn't they just pull the plug on social media? It's because like nobody wants to do it. I mean, they tried to do it with TikTok and they almost had a complete rebellion. Because, and in fact, they didn't pull the plug because in the end you couldn't do it because everyone wanted it so much. So I will just say that I just want to push. By the way, there are unintended consequences, and you should go nuts with them and get other people to do it. But I just want to say that is one thing that always kind of annoys me a little bit about our current way of understanding what happened with the internet. I would say, so for example, I wrote The Long Boom with Peter Schwartz, and we said in 25 years it's going to happen, and then and honestly, largely it all, what happens when you connect up everyone? What happens if the computers keep getting doubling in power? What happens if, the whole world get connected up and all this? And then, but there's a lot of people that hit to 2020 and they say, oh, this has been a disaster. It's been the worst thing that's ever happened to the world. It's like a horrible thing that's happened. I'd say, well, not if you're like the 800 million peasants in China who were living on $2 a day, who got sucked into the globalization phenom and are now living in cities and, productively involved in, sending their kids to college. Is like certainly worked out good for them. And you can kind of go around of the pieces of the puzzle of, yeah, it did hurt some people in manufacturing in Ohio, but, we're a global society, maybe we needed his time for the $2 a day people to get a shot at being part of the global economy. I mean, I'm just saying the whole thing kind of works itself out in these crazy, strange ways. And I think that's what's going to happen with AI. And there are going to be people who are going to lose, but there are going to be a ton of people who are going to live. Let me give you one last thing about this, which I think the education thing is another thing. People sit here, because this is the one thing I think when people talk about the abundant society and AI, like this big notebook of Ezra Klein abundance. They didn't even mention, they barely understand the tech side of it. They're, mostly East Coast dudes. So AI has the ability to be a radical democratizer and spread dramatic abundance to everyone. I'll give you one example. People say if it's almost certain that these AI agents would be individual tutors for any kid for nothing. They're, $20 a month or whatever it's going to be. And people say, well, that's just going to make the rich richer. No, the rich have always had tutors. Every fucking people who have means, their kids get tutored for the SAT tests, whatever, the whole thing, right? And they get individual kind of coaching of their whatever lacrosse sport and everything else. And they've always had it. But this thing would allow some kid in Africa who doesn't have anything to be, as long as they have an internet connection, to basically be tutored by some kind of thing that it's actually, my God, it could be this crazy game changer for that kid. And but we once you crack the model, you can scale it. That's the thing about tech. And so I think we're underestimating the opportunity here of this AI age. And we got to shift that thinking, in my opinion. That's where I'm throwing my work. And that's what I'm going to try to do. And I hope that'll be my piece of the puzzle, add to your project, because it sounds like you're winding down the conversation here. But anyhow, that's my, I would say.
I was actually more interested in the surprises.
The positive surprises.
Yeah, it's not so much the negatives, but unintended consequences are surprises.
Okay, well then there's one right there. Even though people, I think it's going to empower the rich and make them richer, I'm saying no. It's going to be an absolute opposite. It's going to be same thing with healthcare. It's like if you get an AI empowered doctor who's going to monitor you every day and give you a checkup every freaking 24 hours or something, you'll say, yeah, well, the rich will use it. Yeah, the rich have always had that. I mean, like literally in the Bay Area here, you got, if you pay $50,000, you get a concierge doctor who's like watching you and your family every day. And that's literally what that happens here. I mean, I know the guy who's running that company, but I'm saying, but if you had an AI version of that, was super dirt cheap, it's like, then everybody gets it. It's like, well, then, yeah, the health of everybody goes up. I think this is the counterintuitive thing. The surprise is this AI is not going to empower. Well, some scenarios could empower the rich. Take that quadrant, Jay. But if you do it right, it could make a crazy democratize and energize and create a society and economy of abundance in a way that the humans have never seen. And I think that's just as possible at this juncture, but it depends on what we do. And I think we're going to do it, honestly.
So I just learned a little while ago, not almost a year ago, that this is where Khan Academy is going. It's going towards that.
Read his book. That dude, he actually wrote a good book. If you haven't read it, read it.
Yep.
He had early access to ChatGPT 4 before everyone else did. And he started playing with the thing and he said, oh my God, this is like every kid is going to have this thing and it's going to be awesome. And he's completely nuts about it right now. Yeah, but I'm saying that it's going to happen in everything. It's going to be in everything. It's going to be one of those. There's going to be a Khan Academy. There's going to be a Saul Khan in every field who's going to pioneer this thing. And he's going to open it up and say, holy shit, everyone can do this now. And that is going to be insane in terms of, because we've never had anything like it. That's why when people talk about abundance, it means we can actually, the same thing, I'll give you one last other thing about this, about energy. The same thing, that's what's so exciting about clean energy. It's the first time in human history an energy is a technology. And what happens with technologies is you can drive the cost down. And so right now, solar is cheaper by far than coal. There's nobody in their right mind is building a coal, in a developed world at least, building a coal installation. It's cheaper than natural gas now. And here's the point. It's going to get cheaper. It's going to be so freaking cheap that it's going to be the tiles on your roof. It's going to be all over the place. And the thing is, we'll have so much freaking energy, clean energy, won't screw up the environment, that will do crazy stuff. We'll desalinate water. It doesn't matter then, and I think that's the double reverse that we got to think about here is we've entered a phase where the technologies that are now happening are here, are scaling, can create the context for an abundant society. And that is what's happening now. And people just don't understand it. Just like they didn't understand the mid-90s. Holy shit, this thing, when you connect up everyone, it's going to be a game-changing way to do the whole economy, and it's going to create trillion-dollar companies, and it's going to be all kinds of stuff. But it's like, they said, oh, you were nuts. The other thing we said, I don't know if you remember this, Jay, but we were caught up in the mid-90s. This is mid-95. We were caught up in the books and the people that were talking about that the Dow could maybe someday get to 30,000. There was literally a book called Dow 3400 or 3500 or something. I forget what it was that came out right around the Long Boom book. Our book version did. And they lumped us all in the same thing. And these crazy optimists, they said they're thinking, blah, blah, blah. And look, they think the stock market can get to 30,000, 35,000 in, 2020. Like, that's insane. We shouldn't even read these books, right? This is 95. The Dow Jones at that time was 5,000 in the 95, right? Well, by 2020, what happened? It hit 30,000. It was a $30,000 thing because you could see the forward motion of the boom. You could see the scaling up of these things. You could see how these companies could go. You understood that even though Apple was bankrupt in 97, they were 3 months away from bankruptcy. They became the first $1 trillion company. You can see the forward motion of this shit. We're in the same moment now with AI and clean energy, and I would say bioengineering is a little bit of a delay, but that's similar. And that is essentially, we're at the beginning of the scaling. And it's a crazy time to be alive.